Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you're joining us from, and welcome to the WTA webinar, How to Win Business from a Telco or a Mobile Network Operator, which we'll be referring to as MNO. So again, welcome. My name is Robert Bell, and I will be your moderator for today. WTA is an interesting organization if you're not familiar with us. We do two fundamental things. We advocate for the interests, principally the commercial interests of the independent teleport operator around the world. And we also work very hard to promote excellence for them in their operations, in their technology, and in their business practices. And the report you see, the report cover you see on your screen, How to Win Business from a Telco or MNO, was published quite recently. And it's part of that mission to help our members, first of all, learn about markets that they might want to target for their future, or to learn from their colleagues in this business, their fellow members, how to make the most of a particular market segment. And that's the one we're going to be focusing on today. This is a product, like so many other things that we do, of our Technology Advisory Board. And this is a group we formed about 2 years ago. And it was all about dealing with these rising challenges and opportunities that we saw our teleport operator members facing, from OTT and 5G to IoT, LEO, MEO, virtualization. The list goes on. In fact, it gets longer, it seems, every year. And to deal with that onrush of both opportunity and challenge really requires a deeper understanding of technology innovation. And so we formed this group to provide guidance on technology advances and on basically being a smart buyer across all the options that you have to consider when you're thinking about how to incorporate new technologies and new capabilities into your service mix. Membership in the Tech Advisory Board is open to leader and patron members of the association. That's a voluntary level that you can sign up for as a company. And of course, in this case, to members who develop, manufacture, and market technology solutions. And you can see the list of our current members over there on the right side of your slide. So if this is of interest to you, if there's something you think you might like to get involved with, I recommend that you contact our Director of Membership and Projects, R. Barney at worldteleport.org. That's the email address of Randall Barney. So let's go to today. Today's agenda, as usual for WTA, is extremely simple and short. After this brief introduction, I'm going to offer you some key takeaways from that published report, and the actual report itself is available on our website for download. It's free to WTA members, people who work for WTA member companies, and also available for sale to others. And then we'll go switch from there to a panel discussion with some people who know a great deal about the topic, and some Q&A with you. And finally, just a last thank you before we get started. In addition to our Technology Advisory Board, we really could not do any of this work, reporting and webinars, without the financial support of our industry leader members. And they are currently Eutelsat, Intelsat, Kratos Defense and Space, Liquid Intelligent Technologies, and SES. So let's onward to the takeaways from this report. The first one is about the fact that this is quite an important market. Backhaul is one of the industry's most important markets. And it's either, in some estimates, it's the largest and fastest growing, and others it's simply dominant. But what's interesting about it is that service providers take very different approaches to this market. At one end of the spectrum are companies that have decided to approach this as a co-location opportunity. They basically host equipment, they provide connectivity and cross-connection. And at the other extreme are operators who really decided to make this a market that deserves strategic partnerships. So they really get close to their terrestrial, to their MNO customers, and they work to develop a really deep understanding of their needs. Now, the interesting thing is that whichever end of the spectrum your company is on, or even if you're just considering this marketplace, serving telcos, serving MNOs requires a great deal of flexibility to meet them where they are, as opposed to offering them a ready-made solution that you've worked out that works for you. And why is that? Well, the answer is on your screen. Satellite has, unfortunately, a bad reputation with this particular marketplace. And it's also unfortunately deserved. For a very long time, satellite was the absolute last resort for backhaul. The ground segment equipment was extremely expensive and power hungry and large, right? Remember the days of the large antenna. Capacity was high priced. Everything ran on proprietary standards, which required the telco or the MNO to do manual interventions in a process that they had spent decades and tons of money automating, and automating it based on open standards. So even though our industry has changed radically from those bad old days in terms of pricing, in terms of the capability of technology, and the footprint and power demand of that technology, still that perception lingers. So winning their business is really all about making a dedicated effort to create the business model, to show them how it can work, demonstrate that value, and make the case to them as opposed to just taking an order. And what goes along with this, what the corollary to that is very straightforward. Winning telco and MNO business really requires a true commitment to terrestrial and mobile standards. The important ones are carrier Ethernet 3.0, lifecycle service orchestration, virtualization, which makes it possible to spin up service in seconds instead of days, and also to run sophisticated RF and digital processes on commodity servers whenever possible, as opposed to selling them another dedicated box that they've got to deal with. So it's quite a different market from many others, and requires a great deal of us to be successful. And lastly, the non-geostationary satellite operators, however that market evolves, and we still don't really know, are very likely to transform the business of satellite backhaul. We've already been through a cycle of high throughput satellites, pushing down capacity costs to a tiny fraction of what they used to be. Smaller, cheaper ground technology, with lower power demands, has reduced the CapEx part of it. What's next is offering low latency and higher bandwidth at, we hope, prices that are terminals, I should say, terminal costs that are priced for consumer markets, right? That could be a pretty powerful combination. So if NGSOs are viable in the marketplace, they're poised to truly drive backhaul costs even lower while meeting terrestrial latency norms. And as you can imagine, that's quite a gift to give to the telco and MNO groups. And it'll be particularly important as 5G rolls out at some of the lower frequencies for less dense markets where we're going to see some success. So there's a pretty bright future ahead of us if we can figure out how to integrate all of this into the business as it exists today. So to hear about how to do that, we're going to talk to some people who know more about this than I ever will. And they're our panelists for today. The first one is Chris Boyd. He is the Vice President for Product Management at Kratos Defense and Space. He's joined by Richard Sward, who is Senior Vice President for Premium Enterprise and Mobile Operations at Comtech Satellite Network Technologies. And finally, Frank Zullo, who's President of Global Network Solutions at Network Innovations. And we're very pleased to have all of them with us. So welcome, gents. Glad to have you with us. I think this is a repeat performance for both Chris and Richard, and Frank, this is your first time with us, so welcome. Terrestrial carriers, mobile network operators, they work in a world of standards, period. And so the question, I guess, is how effectively, overall, do you think our industry is starting to adapt to that need now? And Frank, why don't you go first?
I think that's two parts. One is how effectively we're doing it and whether we're recognizing whether we have to do it. I think it's starting to become, particularly if you look at the LEOs, they've embraced the idea of standardization, metro Ethernets and things. I would say generally the industry knows that it has to move towards the standardization. I would say we're still lagging in the idea of standardization for fully integrated networks that are heading out there. But I think that's progressing. I think you're seeing the manufacturers of the kits, focusing on that, and integrators such as ourselves. It's a key to us because we're selling networks as opposed to equipment.
Right, and that integration part is such an incredible key. Christopher, what do you think?
So I think, Frank, obviously, I think hit the point in the beginning. I think the industry is recognizing we need it. There are certain of the, NGSO, as you pointed out, constellations who have taken a fresh start and maybe their approach is a bit more modern from a standards perspective. And that kind of points to what I think is the key issue here is that we're in a point of inflection for the industry where we're in a massive investment stage and also a technology disruption. And so I think particularly this is the moment where we have some fertile ground to actually increase our participation in the global telco market, right, and start driving some of the things that we can do, right? Satellite has some unique attributes which make it, as you pointed out, for MNO networks, quite required in certain cases, whether they're offshore networks or emerging rural networks. So I think there's an opportunity right now to be engaging them with better integration and understanding how they want to utilize satellite and start to shift our focus into those standards and more aligned with those terrestrial standards, as you pointed out earlier.
Well, thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. Richard, last word to you. You think we've got about captured it, or are there some other nuances here?
Well, I think both Frank and Chris makes a good point on the direction where we can go. I would like to offer a snapshot of where we are today in terms of supporting standards and kind of give a little bit of history to how we got here. And I think WTA and you, Robert, has captured well in the report a little bit of the challenges and the perception that MNOs and telcos have of satellite technology, and as an option of last resort, or as a technology that may not fit into the overall landscape today. But that's not really true. But I can been working for the last 20 years in mobile backhaul. I want to offer a little bit of history and perspective on how we got here, and that is when mobile backhaul started out decades ago with 2G over satellite. It was TDM based, it was circuit switched based, and point-to-point connections. And when 3G came along, that was also initially TDM based and even ATM based before it eventually transitioned to IP. But while it was TDM based, a point-to-point connectivity, it was there to service the needs of voice and SMS, and it did that quite well. The services were robust, the services were stable, they were still costly, but they met the performance and the requirements of the MNOs quite well. As the industry then evolved and the mobile operators started to require more IP traffic, more asymmetrical data as 3G came along and eventually LTE and so forth, the way we at Comtech approached this was that we developed a technology that was basically meeting the operators where they needed a solution. They needed a layer 2 Ethernet switch in the sky. We were able to provide that on high performance hardware that met the requirements of the MNOs to deliver the services also over IP as well as they had over TDM. Then there was a number of initiatives and players that entered the industry with that came from a different background, from a different perspective in the VSAT enterprise domain, with perhaps technologies that work well in an enterprise environment, but struggle a little bit to meet the stringent requirements that an MNO has when it comes to latency, when it comes to jitter performance, when it comes to packets per second. And what ended up happening was that some of those deployments were not very successful. They were also, many of them, deployed in a layer 3 environment instead of a layer 2 that the telcos most telcos wants to use. They want to have the same type of transport they have for their terrestrial sites, also for their satellite side. So introducing layer 3 added some unnecessary complexity to their solution, and again made satellite a little bit more difficult than it had to be. But the satellite industry learned, and this happened in such a way that the initial deployments that were done with lower performance hardware eventually got upgraded and new, as the satellite industry understood the requirements of the MNOs better, the equipment evolved and became better. In parallel, LTE became more prevalent in the industry around 2010 and forward, and that was a more suitable technology to do with a satellite, more forgiving technology, so to speak. That was easier to meet the KPIs and the performance requirements of that technology. So what happened then was that these two things came together, and as LTE was introduced, the possibility to also do TCP acceleration of the end user traffic became a possibility. And that made satellite look and feel more like a terrestrial connection. In parallel, HTS satellite became into the market, lowering the price points, increasing the performance, reducing the size of the kits. And all of this came together like in a perfect storm and made satellite backhaul, as you stated before, Robert, one of the fastest growing markets there is in the industry right now, and one of the markets that holds the most potential going forward. And we are at the point now where most VSAT equipment supports satellite backhaul very well, and it supports all standards, 2G to 3G to 4G and even 5G today. And it does so with tremendous performance, being able to provide gigabits of throughput if the MNO so wants. And now we're at the point where we have to put the past behind us with the issues we had once upon a time, and look forward to all the great things that we are developing as an industry in terms of further getting closer to the MNOs in terms of open standards and deeper integration between the MNOs and the satellite world. So
I started laughing just because.
Sorry for that long rant,
No,
but it's important I think to kind of set the stage a little bit for where we're going as an industry, to understand the background a little bit as well.
I appreciate it. No, I appreciate it very much. Actually, I learned some things I didn't know. I started laughing just because it's like, oh, great, everything's going to change again. Super.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Let's just drill into then. Okay, so we've heard some history. We've heard the issue that we're just getting started on some of the things that we really, really need to work on. Chris, what do you think are some of the most important requirements for a satellite service provider to build significant business with either a terrestrial carrier or an MNO?
So, I mean, I think Richard started to introduce the satellite industry's been studying this problem for a long time. And whether, I know we're talking about building telco and MNO business, right? But there are other use cases beyond cellular backhaul, right? There's obviously enterprise network extension and telco trunking, right? Are some of the key other, I'll call it, high speed telco centric type services. So one is, I think Richard's absolutely right. The industry, the satellite industry has in particular learned a lot about what we can and can't do with proprietary protocols, what the customers will and will not do. Our specialness, that some of the things that he described in sort of TCP acceleration, like the things that we've had to do that make us special, are starting to wane out a little bit because the protocols are becoming more intelligent. But I think there's still a fundamental need to align the standards and the approach of the standards on the platforms together. So, in terms of being able to drive those requirements in, it's not just technology and vendor statements, right? It's also operational aspects. And so we need to make it easier for those telcos to place orders with providers who are using, in our case, vendor equipment, right? Or in Frank's case, I'll let him speak for himself, but with the network service providers who are stitching together the capabilities. So I think the biggest things, and we highlighted a little bit, but things like carrier Ethernet that you mentioned, that I've mentioned previously, right? I think are fundamental. And Richard mentioned layer 2. Yes, the telcos want to interact with the satellite domain in layer 2, and that's fundamentally been difficult for the satellite industry for reasons of a lot of good reasons, but also some other reasons that maybe aren't so good in the past. So I think getting to a point where we can leverage standardized layer 2, right? Not willy-nilly bridging or just things that are basic layer 2 connectivity, but literally managing Metro Ethernet, which is itself a set of standards driven by the Metro Ethernet Forum, which deal with things like broadcast control and other aspects of layer 2, which aren't desirable, and certain attributes about how the services are built. So I think one of the key things is aligning our operational capability to those standards and also extending those into the service provider's domain so that they can ask the satellite network, I need a service like an E-line service configured and provisioned in this very specific standardized way so that you and I are on the same language and the same format. And so when there's a challenge in the performance of that link, there isn't a lot of finger pointing. We can very specifically go down to the places where that's going to be done. And Telco has been doing that for years with other access types. They've been doing it with fiber, they've been doing it with microwave, they've been doing it with DOCSIS and other technologies. So I think that's one of the key areas of the application of the standards that are actually key on the operational front. And that's going to just dovetail further into when we get to 5G and 5G NTN in particular, which is the satellite, domain of that. That expectation is mandatory, right? The idea to have service profiles and service catalogs, they're very well described by the 5G standard set. And so we're not going to be able to say, well, that's special, we need to adjust it this way. There's just no tolerance for that. I think when we get to 5G, they're going to be like, no, you're going to implement this according to 3GPP. And those are well-defined standards. And of course, we're going to have to figure out how to make our technology work in those definitions. And that's one of the challenges we're currently working through as an industry.
My friends who works for a technology company said the great thing about being a tech company in this space is you get paid first. They got to buy your gear. Frank, that's not quite so. When you're a systems integrator, you actually get paid when it works. So, what do you think are the most important requirements for a satellite service provider to really, kill in this market?
Yeah, I mean, I approach it obviously from maybe a different standpoint, but I think Krista is correct when he talks about operational side. I think we have the technology and the wherewithal. We've advanced in waveforms, we've advanced in protocols. Without sounding arrogant for the industry, I think we've now got it to the idea that there's probably not too many technological problems we can't solve. It's whether we have the desire and the wherewithal to do so. So I think the operational side, the business model side of it, understanding that we all of us have a certain level of, there we go. It had to happen to somebody, I guess.
Absolutely, that's fine. If I still had my cat, it would be right up here on the
the idea that it's really I think the commercial model is what's changing, and to further sort of Chris's standpoint there, those protocols aren't optional, and teleport operators and such, the idea of saying that we're in these subscription contracts and 3-year contracts for uplinks and space segment contracts for that. Think of the old days of data centers and POPs. I mean, that's what we have to become part of that ecosystem. And to become part of that ecosystem, we have to fundamentally change the way that we do business. And to have, I mean, if I were to narrow it down to one word so that I'm not too long and before my dog barks again, I'd say it's flexibility. Operational flexibility and adaptability to what's there. The idea of simply putting some set subscription service in the sky, whether it be for large trunking or whether it be for rural expansion on a cow, it has to be the flexibility side of it for the operator.
Okay, flexibility, but I mean, can you give me an example, for instance, from your observations of something a commercial approach that absolutely has to change? I mean, we've talked already about the idea that you've got to start living in this world, this telco world of standards and so forth and so on. But are there business practices that you see kind of holding back the ground-based service providers?
Sure, I think it's a little bit of business perception. I mean, if you look at, say, the baseband kit manufacturers, they've given us dynamic SCPC backhaul links. They've given us dynamic natured equipment. And I use the example, say, in the MNO where they're using it as a rural expansion on a cellular on wheels. Sorry, I used the term cow. Hopefully people didn't think I was referring to an animal.
I wonder.
Yeah, but we have that sort of capability, and I mean, I've been part of that world for 5 or 6 years of trying to push the idea that we get these new technological capabilities and then we end up wanting to use them the way we always have. So we have these great new advances that the satellite industry is bringing out technologically, but as business leaders, we tend to revert back to what is our business model that makes us money. And we have to be a little bit more, when I say flexible, we have to be a little bit more on the edge to take advantage of the technology. I mean, we can't have a conference without bringing up Elon's name or anything like that. But I mean, the idea that has pushed the edge of not really the technological capability. Yes, obviously there's huge technological advances, but it's forcing other people to rethink the way they're doing business. And I think we have to rethink the way we do operations and the way we have to do business geared towards the idea of flexibility. I mean, T-Mobile didn't get out of the terrestrial business because they were money losing. It's just they didn't think it was part of focus of their business. They did it because they're focusing on the wireless side.
One of my favorite SpaceX stories is when the Falcon 1, I guess, was in development. A bunch of team from NASA went out there to watch their test, and they were launching from some Pacific island, and they had to halt the countdown, and so they said, listen, we're going to recycle the rocket. So they recycled the rocket, and they did it in 30 minutes. They pumped all the fuel out, all the oxidizer, everything, pumped it all back in. And one of the NASA guys turned to the other one and said, that takes us a day. So yeah, a little bit different. Okay, so we've talked about business practices, commercial approaches, perceptions on the part of the marketplace. Are there particular technologies that you're aware of that you think are helping satellite service providers today to bridge that gap between their operations and those of the carrier and the MNO? Richard, let's hear from you.
Well, if you don't mind, Robert, I want to circle back to the
Please.
other question too, and add a little bit perspective there. In my experience of working for telcos or with telcos for many years, and the most important thing from a satellite industry's point of view is meet them where they are, because they're not going to go where you are. Telcos are very rigid and very process driven, and most of them are organized functionally in such a way that they have an organization working on the service layer, another on the core network, another on transmission, another on the radio. And these are silos, these are stovepipes, right? They don't speak to each other. They have their processes and they have their ways of working. And a classic example of that is in cellular backhaul. There comes a market requirements to put the cell site out in a remote region, perhaps. What happens then is that the radio planner get the assignment to put the cell site out in the region. He has a product catalog of base station models that he can pick from. He picks a base station and he puts that into the region. And that base station comes with certain characteristics. It has a certain capacity, it has a certain power requirement, and then it has a certain transmission requirement. And he then takes that requirement and hands it over to the transmission organization, telling them, I put base station model XYZ out here. This is the requirement it has on the transmission side. And that requirement on the transmission side is based on the capacity of the base station. It's not based on the actual traffic or service or use case they're actually trying to solve out there. So what happens many times is that they deploy a model of a base station. Let's say it supports 100 megahertz of spectrum in LTE. That translates into 1 gigabit at least of transmission in the backhaul. So he asked the transmission guys for 1 gigabit of transmission. Well, the use case may be to support a rural highway, or the use case may be to support a small town or a little village that may not end up needing the full 100 megahertz of spectrum or the 1 gigabit of backhaul then. So then the transmission guy goes to the satellite guys and he asks for a 1 gigabit link, and of course the business case doesn't close, because you need to match the satellite comes at a premium, right? The backhaul of satellite is more costly than something that you get over fiber or microwave. So you then want to match the capacity you deploy to the base station with the actual usage that will eventually end up being there. So you get the revenue to match the cost that you have to spend on the OpEx side, right? So this is why when you sell into a telco, you need to penetrate the organization on several different layers. You just can't speak to one organization. You need actually to help them start talking to each other. So the right requirements gets in there so you can deliver the right solution at the end of the day. And don't go in there speaking waveforms or even bandwidth on demand, even though it's an important element of the actual solution, or if it's TDMA or dynamic SCPC or whatever it is. Talk about QoS, talk about SLAs, talk about KPIs, because that's at the end of the day what they are measured at, and we should be measured at, right? And then you go in and you demonstrate that you can deliver a good QoE for the end users at the end of the day. And satellite then becomes a much more relevant technology for these MNOs. So
thank you, Richard. That's really great. I like most of us, I've sold in situations like that, and you just can't believe that you have to do this. But okay.
No, and that's a perfect setup for, I think, the question you asked. So I'm glad Richard went back, because I think he's pointing out something very, very critical, right? Is you have to speak to them in the language that they're using, and right, and that transport side, generally in the terrestrial side, they're going to say, look, I need a backhaul link of a certain KPI. Hey, transport guys, I need a metro Ethernet circuit of X megabits per second with CIRs of the following and the traffic types coordinated. And just to dovetail on both Richard and your question, right? That there's a technology that exists in the terrestrial world so that they can do that to each other, right? So that they can ask for those services between. Because even in terrestrial, one provider has to buy services from another provider, right? Whether it's last mile, fiber loops, intercity exchanges or intercontinental exchanges, right? Those exist. And so, one of the key attributes in terms of the technology that we should be leveraging is the ability for our platforms to talk service orchestration with their platforms. Because at the end of the day, yes, we're going to go talk to those people, but to do it at scale, you're not going to be calling up a guy, and I've done it, right? I'm now aging myself. I've called and asked for local loops. That doesn't happen. I don't call the local CO and get the local loops. This is all automated in the telco. As Richard pointed out, they're very rigid, they're very process oriented. And for quality reasons, they want things all to be very vanilla and similar for troubleshooting reasons. So again, we need to take those technology, and whether it's someone like Frank's organization who's then taking equipment that does this carrier Ethernet type services, right? They need to stitch those services up to a catalog that are exactly the thing that Richard described, right? These are the catalogs I can provide you based on the satellites I can have access to the coverages that I have access to the terminal types that I have access to. But I need to be able to take those orders from the customer in a very defined and standardized way. So it's not just about the technology standards of the actual protocols, as Frank pointed out, but even the order processes and the cataloging are really key. So I'm glad that Richard went back. Thanks for doing that, Richard. That's an important.
No, that's fascinating, because that didn't come up in our interviews for the report. So it's really not just a matter of matching tech; it's a matter of matching business process.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the statement I made earlier, like the operational side of this, and creating services, as Frank pointed out, are also key. Right, and there's another area I think that we didn't cover yet, which is the technologies on. How do we do the things that Frank and Richard both pointed out, is we have to leverage the CapEx and OpEx components to be able to provide those service flexibilities that Frank pointed out earlier. You have to be agile in that sense, right? So we have to also be very concerned about what the CapEx and OpEx of what I just described takes. And so there's a whole list of technologies I think we covered in the report that talk about how you get there. And total cost of ownership concerns. So
that's. Let me just dig in that a little bit more with all of you, particularly Frank. So you you could end up spending huge amounts of money to try to get your first customer, and that's probably that's not how successful teleport operators work. I mean, Frank, how do you step into this from a CapEx standpoint?
Yeah, so I'm going to use an example of where I see some of the industry going, and I think this relates both to Richard's statement and Chris's statement. In selling to the telcos, I'll use the tower example. The typical cellular tower. I mean, the telcos used to deploy their own towers. put their own radios on the towers. And then we've seen the advent of tower companies that come in where now the telco simply buys the service of a tower existing. They don't want to deal with whether the tower has power issues or whether its terrestrial backhaul connectivity is redundant or whatever. They're buying the service of having a tower that their radios get mounted to, and now we see tenanted towers out there. I can see the satellite side being the same thing. Does it become a question of I want that 1 gigabit backhaul, or do I just need backhaul service in this area and I don't care about the transmission, I don't care about all the equipment that goes into it? As the telco buyer, I'm simply saying I need service in that area. That inherently goes to that CapEx question that you're asking, right? How do you have you're not selling an individual service, you're selling a capability, you're selling a network. Therefore, you inherently have CapEx of build it new and they will come sort of scenario. I think that's the challenge when I talk about business practices. I think that's the challenge that we all face is if you look at satellite operators traditionally, their CapEx has been spent in space. And we've seen the advent of CapEx being, spent in terrestrial connectivity and what have you. And to Richard's point, I think it's absolutely key that we're meeting the telcos at their door, not the other way around. Or it's even better to say, do those networks now have to intermingle? Again, to Christopher's standpoint, local loop things, it has to be the ability that we're just another part of the ecosystem. So how do we become that? How do we do that? I think there's some CapEx that has to be spent. There's some OpEx that has to be changed to take, say, teleport operators to be able to play in that ecosystem. So like any traditional business, when your customer's changing, how do you change to adapt to it? I won't name the gentleman, but I had a great conversation years and years ago. It was about, he worked for IBM and he stood up a data center, and everybody thought he was nuts because they spent millions and millions of dollars for this data center and nobody was tenanted in it. And he looked like he was about to end his career until all of a sudden everybody started becoming tenants to his data center. That's a hard hill for a lot of people in business to get over, right? And I think we're there. I mean, when we talk about inflection points, I'm not sure which one of the gentlemen used that term earlier today, but this is an inflection point. Is what is the investment in satellite, not in the physical space assets, but in the customer model, the delivery model going to look like in the next 10 years. And I do think I think there's a CapEx there that has to be spent. And I think there's the challenge now is particularly for independent teleport operators or teleport operators in a more global sense in other parts of the world. They're struggling with what do I have to do? And I think that's the answer that a lot of people are looking for today. And hopefully we can help provide it. And certainly Comtech and Kratos, we're all in it together. We use both of their technologies to try to answer that question. So I think is there a CapEx question? 100%. There's money that needs to be spent.
Yeah, and that's not a new and that's not new in the telco industry, by the way. Everything he just described, the telcos wrestle with every day. And one of the things that they did was they started to look at what the cost of ownership was for that, right? And how do I build it enough that they'll come, and then quickly scale it when they all come. And so obviously there's technology that we're talking about in this conversation and the reports, right, that talk about how do we leverage virtualization and technology and some of the cloud technology to get us there, right? So that's the other piece of this, is that I can't just go buy that stuff. I have to be smart about my business and do that. And so that's one of the things that telcos have done quite well, obviously, is leveraging that. So I think that's part of the CapEx discussion, right? And that's part of the thing that I think the satellite industry hasn't done a great job with so far.
Richard, I mean, I feel like you've already covered this. So if you're comfortable with that, I'm going to ask a slightly different question and turn to you with it, which is a lot of this comes down to the people inside your shop, right? I mean, changing their minds about how things get done, having the understanding of how the terrestrial and mobile carriers need to operate and need to operate. So in your observations, are you finding that most of the people you're selling to in our industry actually, they have the right mix of skills inside that organization? And if not, what are the weaknesses that really need to be addressed? Richard, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I think honestly, I think we're all struggling a little bit to get the right skills and to find the right resources. By the way, comtech.com/careers. There might be a job for you there. So
there you go.
So go there. We're hiring, but obviously, as we are now embarking on a world where cloud native and service orchestration becomes a more important role looking forward, when we're looking to scale, when we're looking at the fact that we want to share resources, we want to have the ability to work more in a way that the cloud providers has done for years, also in a telco environment where the requirements are slightly different. We're talking about high performance, high throughput, very complicated and high process driven functions like running waveforms virtually. That's different from running a business process in the cloud. So we are working towards having the ability to do that and to find the right technologies and skill sets to help our customers build those types of solutions in partnership. And some of them will be in public cloud, some of it will be in a private cloud, but there are still some things that when it comes down to the actual physical layer and the ability to do solutions that are totally virtualized end to end, that we will continue to develop and bring to market with our customers over the next couple of years. So I think we'll bring some very interesting opportunities to match this problem of CapEx, as Frank was talking about earlier, and being able to match the usage with the amount of input you need to put into the solution. So
CapEx and now HumanX.
OpEx also important.
Frank, what's your view on this issue of the sort of the skill mix and how the industry has to fight that battle, if you will, to get what it needs?
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably could all look at our careers pages and see a bunch of vacancies. So I think the point that Richard made is careers and skill sets in this industry we need to have, but maybe on a more strategic level or on a broader level. Similar to many businesses, the skill sets I think we need to really move forward is that view of identifying the problem, the business practices skill set. I'm not going to downplay the technical engineering aspect of it, but I think we've attracted and we have an industry that has been able to self-teach, to self-evolve, to expand. I think the skill set, if to put it in a broad context, I think we need people in the industry that are looking at the business differently. So I'm not saying that we need a bunch of Harvard MBAs or anything that need to show up, but I think there's a unique balance in any engineering crew or in any technological company, or in this case, an industry, of people that can balance and hold technological knowledge in one hand and apply it to business requirement in another. And that's a skill set. I'm sure there's a few people out there saying that's a skill set that's required in any industry, but I think it's really relevant in our industry right now to be able to bridge that gap. And I think that's if I knew where you could just go find that in a store and buy it, I'd hire them. It's probably the hardest skill set to find. I think we probably need to develop that internally. And I think there's a lot of people that are putting out some really good mentoring programs and things like that. But yeah, that balance between tech and business, I mean, it's the age-old problem, I think.
Yeah.
I have an idea where they might be, Robert.
Okay.
So everything that Frank just described, those guys also live in cloud service providers and telcos. So it's actually really important that as we move through this journey on the satellite front, right, that we also have an eye that as we start to adopt the standards that they do and the operational things that they do, satellite becomes interesting to that skill base to go, wow, there's something really cool going on over there. Maybe I'll try my hand at working in satellite. Whereas before I would tell you, satellite would be a little bit off-putting to those folks because of all the proprietary and standardness and specialness, that nichiness that we've had in the past. So, you know, I would tell you that, you know, for the operators and what we've seen, right? And again, we're all referencing career pages. Go look at some of the career pages on our teleport partners and our satellite operators. Who are they hiring? They're hiring cloud architects, business people, right? All the things Frank just pointed out. And the reason why is carrier Ethernet, 5G, like is all coming our way. Virtualization, cloud, like all those things are coming. The bad news is we're all in competition, including the telcos, including the cloud service providers. We're all in competition for that skill set. So I do hope that the Harvards, the MITs, and the, you know, the Stanfords of the world are helping to educate and scale up those programs, because we do need those people. Absolutely.
Yeah.
100% agree.
And as much as we talk about the new players coming into an industry, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of capital being spent on building new constellations and stuff. That brings some renewed interest in our market. Somehow, satellite has become interesting again, because there's some very high-profile names out there talking it up and starting to delivering services. And I think that is a good thing for all of us. That is happening, because that gets the attention of people coming out of universities and starting out their careers, that, oh, wow, there's some cool stuff going on here too, right? Like you said, Chris.
Yeah. No,
Very important.
Thank you, Elon. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jeff.
that's right.
Okay, let's pivot to them then. Just for we're getting toward the end of our hour together. Let's pivot toward these, you know, these fabulous new things that are supposed to make this market blow the top off this market. Satellite-friendly 5G, LEO, MEO constellations. How much do you think that's going to actually? I mean, obviously we don't know, but how much do you think that might affect our competitiveness in this marketplace, as well as what are going to be some of the problems we're going to face in making that part of a complex solution? Richard, why don't we start with you?
Well, so 5G from space, then from LEO or MEO or even GEO is something that is going to happen. It's been standardized in release 17 of the 3GPP standard. So in a few years, we will have the technology both on the ground and in space that would enable these services. And I think that will be a very, very important step forward in the integration between satellite and terrestrial. Obviously, it will support a lot of use cases that are helpful, especially in the low data rate, high value type of communication. And I'm talking about IoT. I'm talking about what we can see in initial performance is it can support voice and SMS and so forth everywhere. So a standard off-the-shelf cell phone with 5G NTN will be able to communicate with these constellations and provide service anywhere. That of course will open up a big market, but we also need to put it a little notion that in the base station is 600 kilometers away for LEO and even further for MEO and GEO. So you can't expect to get the same link budget and the same performance that you would be able to get from a base station that maybe sits a couple of kilometers away from you. So the capacity will be limited and the throughput will be limited, but it will be able to serve several good use cases in emergency response and IoT and so forth. It will take time to develop because you need the latest chipsets. You need new satellite constellations. There are some initiatives in the market, and we can speak about this for hours, that will try to do this using existing chipsets and existing technologies. And we all know who those are. And they will also do a good job of serving some niche use cases in the lower data rate part of the business. But if we talk about the high capacity, high throughput markets, they will not play an important role because there's simply not enough spectrum or link budget available to do it with really high throughput mobile broadband as we used to. So yeah, it will be a nice complement for us for sure. And
So I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I just want to turn to Chris. I mean, okay, so we've got, there's 5G is one thing. We've also got the LEO constellations aggressively marketing themselves even before they're actually fully formed. How is this going to affect our competitiveness in terms of serving the MNO and telco market, do you think?
So, I mean, kind of dovetailing off what Richard mentioned, I mean, so I think you have to slice it into two pieces, right? We have the traditional backhaul or traditional trunking type business, right? And we have where I think he was also referring to, which is direct access, 5G technology to the satellite. So there's good and there's bad in this, right? So the MEOs and the LEOs, principally what's going to happen is all of this innovation going on orbit, all these satellites that are going up with a much reduced cost of getting there. Save the 5G direct access for a moment, right? What's going to happen is a forcing of the cost of bandwidth down just by the amount of capacity coming online. So that's going to be good for the backhaul business and the trunking business, because now we have lower latency accesses potentially in standardized ways, right? Carrier Ethernet in particular, 5G later. I think that we're still watching how that happens, but that will now bring more interest to some of the use cases which have been previously out of reach. So that's the good news. The bad news is a lot of those guys are vertically oriented, right? They're vertically integrated. If you look at all of the LEOs right now are all vertically integrated. There's a couple promises that there's going to be some opening. The MEOs, I think also right now the two that exist are obviously, owned by a single company. And there are others that I know are being planned and things, but again, I think talking to those folks and trying to get them to a point where they can open their networks into the ways we've talked in this call, standardization, the ability to sell services across them, the ability for Frank, as an example, to use mPower as a service offering and do that in a standard way and build a catalog around that, I think are the things that those guys need to be talking about, and then getting the vendors to participate in enabling those capabilities. So that's sort of the good news, bad news of it. But I do see it as all good. And I think we've already seen some examples on the direct access side, which are quite powerful, right? So that the Apple announcement with Qualcomm, with Globalstar is important. Qualcomm is implicated in that because the chipsets are commodity, to Richard's point earlier. And I think the last part of that is that's going to force an opening of the edge that I don't think we're completely prepared for on the satellite industry, right? Those are all very protected domains, right? They're all proprietary domains in terms of the modems and the technologies on the edges. And so I do think we're going to see, in addition to those other factors, right, we're going to see a forcing open of the edge, either using the commodity chipsets or using the protocols and sets, right? So I suspect we're going to see a lot more forcing of interoperability between platforms. So there's a lot of great things about to happen. There's some challenging things that are going to happen for the various parts of the industry, but I think it's all good for the customer because they're going to have choices. And I'm going to, say Frank is a consumer of those guys, right? He's a customer, but he's also creating, solutions for customers. So I think the opportunity is really high. And then I'm sure Frank has an opinion on, he's got to stitch those vertical integrations together. So,
Let's
that's
go, last word to you, Frank. So about I didn't realize you were a seamstress or I don't know what the male version of a seamstress is, but anyway, go ahead.
There you go. A tailor.
Tailor, duh. Yeah, sorry.
I'm going to use a quote where I have no idea who to attribute it to, but it's the slowest acceptable speed is the fastest I've ever gone. And that relates to our industry today. So I guess if we look at the idea of, a rising tide lifts all ships, the ecosystem, I know it's an overused word a thousand times, but I think in this case it really does apply. And Richard mentioned QoS earlier. different bearers, and this is where we are the tailor and where we do stitch things. Different bearers have different applications. I mean, you want snappy response times, the LEOs, the latency, the whatever. But does latency matter when you're streaming video? You know, we can go to geos and things. So how do you bridge that, right? How do you focus on what the services that you're delivering and not on the bearer that is delivering it? So if you ultimately look, say, 5 or 6 years from now, or I should stop that, because someone will play this recording back 5 or 6 years from now and tell me that I was 3 years too long. The speed at which we're changing things now is dramatically increasing. I mean, the solutions that we offered 20 years ago got eclipsed 10 years later. Solutions we offered 5 years ago got eclipsed 2 years ago. Solutions we're offering today are probably going to get eclipsed in 6 months, to be honest. I think it's going to be that ecosystem that allows it to tap into all of the orbits. So whether it be a LEO, whether it be a MEO, whether it be a GEO, I see more LEO GEO than MEO. MEO has its applications mostly in a bridge on the terminal aspect. But I think you're going to see somebody who wants an Ethernet cable, and they're not even going to know whether it travels over GEO or whether it travels over MEO, because it's going to be based on the QoS that Richard talked about, right? So it's going to be traffic that's bearer selective based on the application.
You got to build it, and then 6 months later you got to throw it out and start over again.
Well, I mean, that's just the speed of the world right now.
Right, but that also goes to service agility. Ethernet is standardized. Ethernet's been around for as long as, I can remember, for sure, or close to it. But the ability to create new service catalogs on that is exactly the point we've all touched on. And I think Frank's making the point, the orbit shouldn't matter. You shouldn't care. But as long as the SLA is matched against the service requirements, we can serve the things that Richard talked about, the extension cases that I've talked about. So that's really the point, is service agility, right? Becomes key in exactly what Frank mentioned there.
Unfortunately, we need to leave it there. We've actually run out of time. I have learned so much from this particular webinar. So thank you. I want to thank very, very much Chris Boyd, Richard Sward, and Frank Schulo for sharing their insights with us. I think everybody who listened to this took away a great deal, and those who are going to be watching the recording will take away even more. So do take a moment to fill out our online survey after the webinar. Your feedback is always appreciated. It helps us improve this. You are also, there is a link in our chat to download from the WTA website our summary version of this report, as well as you can go there directly and buy the whole thing, or download it for free if you're a member. Looking forward, WTA has got some stuff coming up. In January, we will be doing a workshop at PTC 2023. It's being led by a member executive of ours. But if you have any questions about that or want to arrange a meeting in the future, you can always email rbarney@worldteleport.org. Coming up next year, upcoming reports: how green is my teleport? Emission and cost reduction strategies, tech and practices that meet climate change goals and are good for the bottom line at the same time. This is actually coming out of a new effort that we'll begin talking about in January. Our Corporate Social Responsibility Committee has come up with a very interesting program to work on issues of environmental sustainability, but also talent attraction into our industry, something that came up today. And finally, then later in March, we'll be doing ground segment, really just a service. If you talk to some of the more creative GSAAS providers, it sort of begins to seem as all you need is a computer and some software and you're done. But of course, we know that you actually have to at some point connect to a satellite. So how do these new and traditional means integrate with each other? What markets do they target? What are the issues, both commercial and otherwise, that are created from this new class of service? We'll be looking at that in March. So thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, and be well.